Emma Johnson glanced anxiously at the eviction notice crumpled in her hand. Her stomach churned as she read the bold words again, her fingers tightening around the thin paper as if she could squeeze out a different outcome. She had begged Mr. Taylor's assistant to let her explain her late payments, but every attempt was met with cold formality. Now, she had only days left before she and her kids would be out on the street. At precisely 9 a.m. the following morning, Emma arrived at Henry Taylor's office, having pulled together every last bit of composure. She'd barely slept, running over every point, every word she could say that might give her a shred of sympathy from the notoriously harsh landlord. She hoped, desperately, that he might grant her just one more month. "Ms. Johnson," said the receptionist, barely looking up, "Mr. Taylor will see you now." Emma took a deep breath and stepped into the office. Henry Taylor was seated behind a vast mahogany desk, fingers steepled, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He didn't invite her to sit. Instead, he regarded her with an expression that was almost clinical, as if he were observing a specimen rather than a human being with 2 kids facing homelessness. "Mr. Taylor," Emma began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Thank you for seeing me. I wanted to explain about the rent and to ask if it might be possible to grant a little more time. I'm doing everything I can to catch up. My hours at work have been cut, and—" Henry held up a hand, silencing her. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone void of any warmth or empathy, "I'm a businessman. When you signed the lease, you agreed to a clear set of terms and deadlines. I am not responsible for your hours at work, nor am I here to subsidize your personal struggles." Emma swallowed, trying to hold back the tears prickling at her eyes. "I understand that, sir. I do. But my children, they need a roof over their heads. If you could just give me a few weeks, I'll have the money. I promise. I've even picked up extra shifts." Henry leaned back, sighing. "Your personal situation, Ms. Johnson, does not factor into my business decisions. If I made exceptions for every tenant with a hard luck story, I would be out of business. We don't offer charity here, and I'm afraid I don't intend to start with you." Emma blinked, stunned. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected his total lack of concern. "But, Mr. Taylor, you have to understand, I've been in that apartment for over 2 years, and I've never missed a payment until now. I just need a little more time." He glanced at her, almost amused, but his tone remained cold. "Ms. Johnson, your history of payment is irrelevant if you cannot keep up now. I do not negotiate with tenants. I provide a service, and they pay for it, period." She took a shaky breath, clenching her fists in an effort to keep her voice steady. "Sir, I'm just asking for one more month. If you could—" "Ms. Johnson," he interrupted sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This conversation is over. You have until the end of the month. After that, the eviction proceeds as planned. And frankly, your insistence is beginning to border on disrespect." Emma's face flushed with humiliation, and she bit her lip to keep from letting her emotions show. She wanted to tell him that her kids were everything, that her youngest son had been up all night with a fever, that she'd pawned her wedding ring just to buy groceries last week. But she could see the steely glint in his eye, could sense the walls he had built against any appeal to empathy. She was just another tenant to him, a problem to be dealt with. She swallowed her pride, forcing herself to meet his gaze one last time. "Mr. Taylor," she said quietly, "I don't have anywhere else to go." He raised an eyebrow, his voice chillingly calm. "Then perhaps you should have considered that before missing your payments." With that, he gestured toward the door, signaling that their conversation was finished. Emma felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by helplessness. There was no winning here. No amount of pleading or logic would break through the man in front of her. She had seen it in his eyes. He had no intention of seeing her as anything more than a defaulting tenant. As she turned to leave, Henry's voice stopped her. "One last piece of advice, Ms. Johnson," he said. "I recommend you avoid making a scene or taking this to court. Your situation is what it is, and any attempt to disrupt my business will end poorly for you." Emma's hands shook as she exited his office, humiliation burning her cheeks. Her mind was racing, panic swelling in her chest. She felt like she'd been punched. She had nowhere else to go, no other options. And for a moment, she almost felt defeated, almost ready to give up. But then she thought of her children, of her 7-year-old's curious brown eyes and her toddler's sweet laugh. They didn't understand the fear in her eyes, nor did they deserve to be punished for circumstances beyond their control. She couldn't let them down. She wouldn't. Outside, she leaned against the building, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed help, someone who would see her as a person, someone who would understand. And in that desperate moment, only one name came to mind: her brother, Anthony. Pulling out her phone, she hesitated. It had been a while since she'd asked for anything from him, and she hated feeling like a burden. But this wasn't about her pride. It was about her kid's future. Finally, she dialed his number. Emma. His voice was warm and familiar, instantly making her feel safer. Anthony, I need your help. She didn't have to say much more. He heard the tremor in her voice. Tell me what happened. She took a deep breath, explaining the meeting with Henry, her fear, and the looming eviction. With every word, the weight of her situation felt lighter, knowing that Anthony was listening, taking it all in. That man has no right, Anthony said, his voice filled with controlled anger. Emma, listen to me. I'll handle this. You don't have to go through this alone. Emma exhaled, feeling the first glimmer of hope she'd had in days. Anthony arrived at Emma's apartment later that afternoon, his face set with a calm determination that Emma recognized well. It was the same expression he wore before every court case. Emma had tidied up as best she could, hiding the bills that had piled up and wiping down the cluttered surfaces. But Anthony saw through her efforts. He looked around, noticing the patched-up couch, the faint water stains on the ceiling, and the mix of toys that her boys had left scattered around. Emma, he said quietly, setting his briefcase on the table, you shouldn't have had to go through this alone. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. Emma tried to smile, but her eyes dropped to the floor. I thought I could handle it. And you're always so busy, Anthony. I didn't want to bother you with my problems. Your problems are my problems, Em, he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. And no one should be treated the way Henry Taylor treated you. She nodded, her gaze turning toward her children's room, where her boys were playing, unaware of the upheaval that threatened their home. It's just so demeaning, like he didn't even see me as a person. Anthony's jaw tightened. That's his whole strategy, Emma. Men like Henry Taylor rely on people feeling powerless. They intimidate, they dehumanize, and they don't expect anyone to fight back. He paused, his eyes flashing with determination. But I'm not going to let him get away with this. Emma exhaled shakily, relief flooding over her. So, what do we do now? Anthony opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. First, we're going to make sure you're prepared. He's counting on you not having any support or resources, so we're going to show him he's wrong. I've already started gathering records, your payment history, proof of your job situation, and I've been reaching out to other tenants in his buildings. Emma's eyes widened. Other tenants? Anthony nodded. You're not the first person he's treated like this, Emma. I've spoken to a few tenants who shared similar stories. They've been bullied, pressured, and pushed out of their homes. And many of them are in situations like yours. Single parents, low income, people he thinks won't fight back. The realization hit her hard. So, he just does this to people who can't fight? That's exactly what he does, Anthony replied, a steely edge in his voice. And the more we dig, the more it's becoming clear that this isn't an isolated incident. Henry Taylor has built his entire business model on pushing out vulnerable tenants to maximize profit. He uses legal threats and intimidation, but he stays just within the line of legality so that no one can hold him accountable. Emma stared at her brother, feeling a mixture of gratitude and anger. And you really think we can stop him? Anthony's face softened. Yes, Emma. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I have to be honest with you. It won't be easy. Henry will come at us with everything he has. He'll try to discredit you, maybe even dig up anything he thinks he can use against you. Emma's throat tightened as she glanced around the small apartment. She thought about all the sacrifices she'd made, how she'd stretched herself thin to provide for her kids. The thought of someone like Henry using her hardships against her sent a chill down her spine. But, Anthony added quickly, you have something he doesn't, Emma. You have the truth, and you have me. I'll be with you every step of the way. A moment of silence passed between them, Emma's fear slowly giving way to resolve. She took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's do it." The next morning, Anthony made a series of calls. He gathered statements from former tenants who had been forced out by Henry's practices and collected evidence of suspicious fees and sudden rent hikes that seemed aimed at driving out low-income residents. Every piece of information painted a clearer picture of Henry's calculated approach to running his business. Later that afternoon, Anthony and Emma stood outside Henry's office building, ready to file an official complaint. Anthony had insisted on accompanying her, knowing that Henry wouldn't take her seriously if she came alone. When they reached the reception desk, Anthony announced their arrival. "Anthony Lewis and Emma Johnson, here to see Mr. Taylor," he said, his voice calm but firm. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Taylor wasn't expecting. "I'm sure he wasn't," Anthony interjected, offering a cold smile. "But I think I want to hear what we have to say." After a few tense moments, the receptionist led them into Henry's office. He looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to a calculating, dismissive smirk as his eyes fell on Emma and then on Anthony. "Ms. Johnson, I thought we had already discussed everything," Henry said, his tone dripping with mock concern. "I'm afraid there's nothing more to say." Anthony stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Actually, Mr. Taylor, I think there's quite a bit left to discuss." Henry's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Anthony Lewis," he replied, his voice steady. "Emma's brother and her legal counsel." Henry's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, adopting a patronizing tone. "Mr. Lewis, I understand your concern, but this is a straightforward matter. Your sister failed to meet her obligations as a tenant, and now we're proceeding with the eviction. This isn't something you can argue your way out of." Anthony crossed his arms, unshaken. "I'm here to make sure my sister is treated fairly, Mr. Taylor. And from what I've seen, fairness isn't exactly a priority for you. We've gathered testimonials from other tenants, all describing a pattern of intimidation and discriminatory practices." Henry's face darkened. "Be very careful with your accusations, Mr. Lewis. I'm a respected businessman. I don't appreciate baseless slander." Anthony held his ground. "I don't deal in slander, Mr. Taylor. I deal in facts. And the fact is, there's enough evidence to warrant a full investigation into your practices. I'd advise you to consider that before dismissing this as straightforward." A tense silence filled the room, the air thick with unspoken threats. Henry leaned back in his chair, his face carefully blank, but Emma could sense his irritation beneath the surface. "Very well, Mr. Lewis," he said finally, his tone icily polite. "If you insist on pursuing this, I'll have my legal team contact you. But I warn you, this will not end well for your sister." Anthony's smile didn't falter. "The only thing that won't end well is your attempt to abuse your power without consequence, Mr. Taylor. We'll see you in court." As they left the office, Emma's heart raced with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with Anthony by her side, she finally felt a glimmer of hope. The courtroom was buzzing. News of the case had spread, and now reporters were crammed into the gallery, eager to capture every detail. Henry entered confidently, dressed in a sleek suit, his expression calm and unfazed by the growing attention. To him, this was still just a nuisance, a temporary setback he intended to dismiss as quickly as possible. Emma and Anthony sat together at the plaintiff's table. She felt the weight of every eye on her, but Anthony's presence steadied her. "You're doing great," he whispered, sensing her nerves. "Just remember why we're here." The judge called the courtroom to order, and both parties presented their opening arguments. Henry's attorney, a polished man in his 50s, wasted no time portraying Henry as a legitimate businessman who had provided reasonable notice and options to a tenant who simply failed to pay. When it was Anthony's turn, he stood calmly, his voice measured. "This case isn't about missed rent, Your Honor. It's about a pattern of predatory practices that specifically target vulnerable tenants like my client. We have ample evidence to show that Mr. Taylor routinely engages in tactics meant to force out lower-income tenants who cannot easily fight back." The judge's face was impassive, but he nodded for Anthony to proceed. Anthony called his first witness, a former tenant named Rachel, who took the stand and testified about her experience under Henry's management. Her story was disturbingly similar to Emma's. She described late fees that suddenly appeared, intimidating letters, and frequent threats of eviction despite her consistent attempts to negotiate. Rachel spoke with a shaky voice, visibly uncomfortable, but determined to tell her story. When Henry's attorney attempted to dismiss her testimony as irrelevant, Anthony stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit these records showing that Ms. Perkins and over a dozen other tenants all reported similar treatment from Mr. Taylor's management company." He handed the documents to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge. The judge glanced over the papers before looking back at Henry's attorney, unimpressed. "Mr. Taylor's history with previous tenants will be allowed as evidence," he stated, silencing any objections. Emma watched Henry from across the room, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of unease cross his face. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a slight shift, a moment where his control seemed to falter. Next, Anthony called Emma to the stand. She took a deep breath, glancing at her brother for support before facing the courtroom. Anthony began gently, guiding her through the events leading up to the eviction. She described her efforts to pay, her repeated requests for an extension, and Henry's complete refusal to consider her situation. "Ms. Johnson," Anthony continued, his voice calm but firm, "can you explain how Mr. Taylor's actions have affected you and your family?" Emma took a shaky breath, her voice trembling. "I work 2 jobs, Your Honor. I don't have much, but I've always tried to give my kids a stable home. When Mr. Taylor refused to work with me, it wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about feeling like no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough." Henry's attorney objected, claiming emotional appeals had no place in the court, but Anthony countered smoothly. "Your Honor, this case is about how Mr. Taylor's policies impact the lives of real people. Ms. Johnson's testimony speaks directly to that point." The judge allowed it, nodding for Emma to continue. Emma looked directly at Henry, her voice growing stronger. "I came to you, Mr. Taylor. I told you about my children, and you didn't care. You looked at me like I was nothing, and for a while I almost believed it." She hesitated, her gaze never wavering. "But I'm here now because I want you to know that we deserve respect. All of us." The room was silent. Henry's jaw tightened, and he leaned toward his attorney, clearly uncomfortable. Anthony continued with his case, presenting documented examples of Henry's frequent rent hikes and arbitrary fees that always seemed to target low-income tenants. Witness after witness came forward, each one sharing stories of intimidation, of notices given with impossible deadlines, of forced moves in the dead of winter. Each testimony seemed to chip away at Henry's unshakable confidence. When Henry took the stand, his demeanor was cool, almost dismissive. His attorney started with carefully crafted questions, each designed to present Henry as a straightforward businessman. "Mr. Taylor, do you believe you've acted within the law with regard to Ms. Johnson and other tenants?" "Yes," Henry replied confidently. "I've followed all regulations and timelines as outlined by local laws. Any tenant that has been asked to leave has done so for legitimate reasons." Anthony approached for cross-examination. "Mr. Taylor, do you recall ever meeting Ms. Johnson before today?" Henry hesitated, glancing briefly at Emma before replying. "I believe I may have, briefly. Can you describe that interaction?" Henry shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "She requested more time to pay her rent, which I could not grant. My decision was purely based on the terms of her lease." Anthony leaned forward, his voice unyielding. "Mr. Taylor, would you say that you ever consider the personal circumstances of your tenants? Or do you see them merely as contractual obligations?" Henry's face hardened. "I don't believe it's my responsibility to manage other people's financial issues. I'm not running a charity, Mr. Lewis. This is a business." Anthony's lips tightened, and he nodded, almost as if he'd expected this answer. "So, Mr. Taylor, you're saying you don't feel any obligation to consider the well-being of those who depend on your properties for homes?" Henry remained silent, but the faintest twitch in his expression betrayed him. Anthony paused, then continued in a softer tone. "I'd like to remind you, Mr. Taylor, of a particular case several years ago. A tenant, a single mother, came to you asking for an extension just like Ms. Johnson did. Do you recall how you handled that case? Henry looked visibly irritated. I don't remember every tenant who's asked for an extension, Mr. Lewis. I understand, Anthony replied, his gaze piercing. But I remember it, because I was there. I was in that courtroom, representing that tenant, who lost her home. You were just as dismissive then as you are now. Do you remember what you told her? Henry's face paled slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. You told her, everyone is replaceable. People like you, especially. Anthony's voice was calm, but his words landed with precision, reverberating through the courtroom. Do you still believe that, Mr. Taylor? The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Henry's lawyer shifted nervously, clearly sensing that things were slipping beyond control. Henry looked at Anthony, his expression taut. I don't recall saying that, he stammered. Anthony turned to the judge, speaking firmly. Your Honor, I believe this testimony reveals Mr. Taylor's true attitude toward his tenants, a perspective that is both discriminatory and dehumanizing. This is not about enforcing a lease. This is about a pattern of behavior that aims to exploit and remove those who have limited means to fight back. As Anthony returned to his seat, Emma glanced over, her heart pounding. For the first time, she felt the possibility of victory, a glimmer of hope that perhaps the system wasn't completely stacked against her. Henry sat, visibly rattled, a sheen of sweat beginning to gather on his forehead. His image as an unassailable businessman was crumbling, and he knew it. As the case moved forward, Henry Taylor's confidence had clearly diminished. The witnesses, the documents, the courtroom atmosphere, everything seemed to weigh against him. But in spite of the mounting pressure, Henry hadn't given up. He was used to being in control, used to having the final word, and he still believed he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. On the fourth day of the trial, Anthony took a different approach. Instead of directly challenging Henry, he brought in one last witness, Mrs. Althea Parks, an elderly woman who had lived in one of Henry's buildings for nearly 20 years. She entered the courtroom with a steady determination, her frail figure somehow exuding resilience. She was greeted with a respectful silence as she took her place at the stand. Mrs. Parks, Anthony began, his voice softer. Could you please tell the court how you know Mr. Taylor? Mrs. Parks straightened, looking directly at Henry. I've known him for years, though he might not remember me, she said, her tone calm but pointed. I live in one of his properties, and I've seen him visit the building. I remember when he took over the management. Everything changed after that. Anthony nodded, encouraging her to continue. Could you describe how things changed? She took a deep breath. He raised the rent, first of all. It wasn't sudden, just a little more each year, but it added up. And the maintenance, well, repairs started taking longer. He used to send contractors who did cheap fixes. The elevators broke down all the time, and once they didn't fix the heating for over a month in the winter, her voice grew a bit softer. People who couldn't pay on time got letters, warnings that they had to leave. Some of them tried to reason with him, but he never listened. Henry's lawyer stood to object. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Ms. Johnson's case has nothing to do with maintenance issues in other buildings. But Anthony countered smoothly. Your Honor, Mrs. Parks' testimony speaks to Mr. Taylor's pattern of neglect and harassment of his tenants, especially those in vulnerable positions. This is relevant to the case as it demonstrates his disregard for tenant well-being. The judge nodded for Mrs. Parks to continue. Henry sat quietly, his face rigid, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Mrs. Parks, Anthony resumed, did you ever feel threatened by Mr. Taylor? She hesitated, glancing at Henry before responding. Not directly. He never threatened me face to face. But the fear, it was always there. I'd seen him force others out, families with children, people who had nowhere else to go. And I knew that if I ever fell behind, I'd be next. Her voice wavered, but she continued. I lived in fear that I'd lose my home, and I've lived there my whole life. Emma watched, captivated. She could see the toll it was taking on Henry to hear these testimonies, his own tactics laid bare in front of everyone. The more Mrs. Parks spoke, the more Henry shifted in his seat, his expression showing signs of frustration. Then, Anthony surprised everyone by calling Henry back to the stand. Henry looked stunned but rose. reluctantly returning to the witness chair. His lawyer attempted to intervene, but the judge overruled him. "Mr. Taylor," Anthony began, his voice calm but firm. "You've heard what Mrs. Parks and other tenants have said about your practices. How do you respond?" Henry's eyes narrowed. "I don't deny that I raise rents. That's standard business practice. And as for the maintenance, I can't personally oversee every building. I hire contractors, and it's their responsibility to address issues. I do what's necessary to run my business." Anthony nodded, but his gaze remained sharp. "So you acknowledge that your practices may have caused stress and hardship to tenants like Mrs. Parks?" Henry's lips tightened. "I run a business, Mr. Lewis, not a charity. If my tenants are unhappy, they're free to find other accommodations." The courtroom murmured, and Anthony allowed the tension to build before asking his next question. "Mr. Taylor, do you remember the tenant from several years ago? The one who asked for an extension and was denied, leaving her and her children with nowhere to go?" Henry stiffened, his gaze shifting. "I told you, Mr. Lewis, I don't remember every tenant." Anthony leaned forward. "I find that hard to believe, Mr. Taylor. I think you remember her well. I think you remember how she pleaded with you, just like my sister did. And I think you remember that it was your decision, your lack of compassion, that put her on the streets." For a moment, Henry was silent. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. He glanced toward his attorney, but the man only looked away, clearly unsure of how to salvage the situation. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice low and measured. "Mr. Lewis, I'm sorry for what happened to that woman. But this is business. It's not personal." Anthony's voice grew sharper. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Taylor. For the people you've evicted, it's deeply personal. It's their lives, their security, their dignity. You hide behind business, but you're exploiting people's vulnerabilities." Henry's face reddened, his polished demeanor slipping. "That's enough, Mr. Lewis. You're trying to paint me as a monster, but I'm just doing my job." Anthony turned to the judge, a look of finality in his expression. "Your Honor, I think we've seen all we need to see. Mr. Taylor's testimony speaks volumes." The judge called for a recess, and the courtroom emptied, leaving Emma, Anthony, and Henry among the last to leave. As Emma passed Henry, she looked him in the eye. "I thought maybe you'd see things differently," she said quietly. "I thought maybe you'd understand what this is doing to people." Henry's face was tight, but he offered no response. Back in the courtroom after the break, the judge reviewed all the evidence, weighing each side's arguments carefully. Henry's lawyer attempted to counter with polished explanations and justifications, but the testimonies were too damning, too detailed to brush aside. When the judge returned with a decision, the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony of the witnesses, he began, his tone solemn. "It is clear that Mr. Taylor's practices demonstrate a consistent pattern of harassment and neglect toward his tenants, particularly those in vulnerable positions. This court finds in favor of Ms. Johnson and orders Mr. Taylor to cease all eviction proceedings against her and to adjust her lease under fair and equitable terms." Emma's heart pounded as she heard the words, relief washing over her like a flood. The decision was not only a victory for her, but for every tenant Henry had mistreated. The judge continued, "Furthermore, Mr. Taylor's business practices will be subject to an independent review to ensure compliance with ethical standards." Henry's face was ashen, his once unshakable demeanor now shadowed by a mix of disbelief and anger. He stood, about to say something, but his attorney placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Realizing he'd lost, Henry left the courtroom without a word, his shoulders tense with the humiliation of defeat. Emma turned to Anthony, eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find words that fully expressed her appreciation. Anthony smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You did this, Emma. You stood up, and you won. No one will look at you like that again." As they left the courthouse, Emma felt lighter, free of the dread that had haunted her. But she knew this victory wasn't just hers. It was a step toward justice for everyone Henry had mistreated. And though the battle had been long and grueling, she finally felt hopeful for her family's future. In the days following the trial, Henry Taylor found himself at a crossroads. The ruling had not only impacted his finances, but also shattered his reputation. Former tenants, emboldened by Emma's victory, began to come forward with their own complaints, and his business was under intense scrutiny. For the first time in his career, Henry was forced to confront the reality that his power and influence were waning. Emma, meanwhile, experienced a newfound sense of stability. For the first time in months, she didn't wake up dreading the threat of eviction. Her lease had been revised with fair terms, and with Anthony's continued support, she felt secure in her home. Yet, despite her relief, there was a part of her that wondered what would become of Henry. A few weeks after the trial, she received an unexpected call from him. The voice on the other end was uncharacteristically quiet, almost hesitant. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his tone softened, devoid of its usual authority. "This is Henry Taylor. I was wondering if we might be able to meet in person. I know I'm the last person you want to speak to, but there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Something important." Emma hesitated, her immediate instinct to refuse. She had won the case, after all, and Henry no longer had any power over her. But there was something in his voice, a vulnerability she'd never heard before. Reluctantly, she agreed, arranging to meet him the following day at a small cafe nearby. When she arrived, Henry was already seated, looking far less composed than she'd ever seen him. He seemed older, tired, and more worn than the confident man she remembered from their last encounters. He gestured for her to sit, a hint of awkwardness in his movement. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, glancing down at his hands before looking back up. "I know I don't deserve your time. Not after everything." Emma crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "Why did you want to meet, Mr. Taylor?" He took a deep breath, struggling to find his words. "I wanted to apologize, Ms. Johnson, for the way I treated you and the way I've treated so many people over the years." He paused, his gaze dropping. "I realize now that I saw people as obstacles, as numbers on a page, and I was wrong. I lost sight of everything but my own ambition." Emma's expression softened slightly, though she didn't yet speak. Henry continued, his voice strained with unaccustomed humility. "The truth is, I built my business from nothing, and somewhere along the way, I became obsessed with the idea that I had to protect it at all costs. But I realize now that protecting it meant hurting people. Good people like you and Mrs. Parks and countless others who deserve better." He hesitated, his voice quieter. "Losing in court, hearing those testimonies, it forced me to face myself, and it wasn't a pretty picture. I saw a man I don't want to be." Emma watched him carefully, feeling an unexpected wave of compassion for the man who had once shown her none. She thought of the years he'd spent building walls around himself, the years she'd spent tearing them down just to survive. And though his words couldn't erase the past, she sensed a genuine regret in him. "So, what now, Mr. Taylor?" she asked, her tone gentler. He nodded, almost as if he'd been waiting for the question. "I want to do things differently. I can't change what I've done, but I can choose a different path forward. I'm planning to revise my policies across all my properties to make sure tenants are treated fairly and with dignity." He looked her in the eye, his expression sincere. "And I wanted to thank you for giving me the push I needed to realize that." Emma's eyes softened, and she nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. It takes a lot to admit mistakes, and I respect that you're willing to change." He smiled slightly, an expression that held both relief and gratitude. "Please call me Henry." Over the following months, true to his word, Henry implemented changes across his properties. Maintenance was improved, rent policies were adjusted to be more accommodating, and he started a tenant support program to help those struggling financially. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but his efforts were genuine, and gradually, the tenants began to notice the difference. Emma, too, found a new chapter opening in her life. With her housing secure, she could finally focus on her work and on spending time with her children without the constant fear of instability. Anthony continued his legal work with renewed vigor, inspired by the success of Emma's case and committed to advocating for others facing similar hardships. Henry's relationship with his tenants slowly improved as he put in the effort to engage with them and understand their needs. Though many were initially skeptical, his actions gradually began to restore a degree of trust. He even attended a community meeting organized by Anthony, standing alongside other landlords and housing advocates to support fair practices. The experience was humbling, a far cry from the detached businessman he once was, but he found himself oddly at peace with it. For Henry, redemption didn't come with fanfare. It came slowly, through small gestures, daily choices, and the patience to rebuild trust. In time, he came to understand that true strength lay not in maintaining control, but in learning to listen, to empathize, and to act with integrity. One afternoon, Henry stopped by Emma's building to see how things were progressing. As he entered, he saw Emma and her children in the hallway, laughing together as they carried groceries. She looked up, noticing him, and gave him a small, genuine smile. "Hello, Henry," she said, her voice warm. He nodded, returning her smile. "Hello, Emma. How's everything going?" "Better," she replied, and he knew there was a world of meaning in that one word. The two stood there for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They didn't need words to acknowledge the journey they had been on, the ways they had both been transformed. Henry saw in her eyes the strength that had once terrified him, and now it was a strength he admired. As he left the building, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before, a purpose not built on power or control, but on something deeper, something real. He had once been a man who saw people as numbers, as contracts, as obstacles. Now, he saw them as people, each with their own stories, struggles, and hopes. And he was finally at peace with the choice to protect them, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. In the end, both Henry and Emma found themselves changed, not through victory or defeat, but through the unexpected and often difficult path toward understanding. It was a quiet redemption, one that went unnoticed by most, but for those whose lives had intersected, it was a transformation that mattered. And for Henry Taylor, it was the beginning of a legacy that he hoped, in time, would be defined not by profit, but by compassion.